to how we think of things. But Abraham Lincoln put a lot of thought and had a lot of advice from individuals within his cabinet as well as Congress on how to deal with the situation legally. So to that point, for example, throughout the conflict, and we're going to address these other points because they're key points in how this war played out, Abraham Lincoln never acknowledged the existence of the Confederate States of America as a real thing. To do so would to legitimize the CSA as an actual nation. So throughout the conflict, he referred to it as states in rebellion. That again, to acknowledge the existence of a Confederate States of America under the authority of Jefferson Davis would be to legitimize the CSA on an international level. In addition to that, Abraham Lincoln did attempt to preserve the Union in a variety of ways throughout the war by trying to prevent the theft of what he called property, i.e. slaves, and again operating as if he was putting down a national rebellion as opposed to trying to force states to remain in the Union.
Well, the Western states, or correction, they weren't states, they were territories at the time, so they had not received statehood as of yet. But the southern states wanted the soon-to-be new states to be slave states. What would be their reason for wanting a territory that they had no current interest in, to want to go to being a slave-holding type of state?
It ultimately came down to notions of freedom or interpretations of freedom. Again, going back to the Dred Scott decision, I want to say it's 1857 off the top of my head, that many Southerners felt that Supreme Court decision essentially guaranteed them the freedom to take their property, including slaves, to any state or territory throughout the Union. So again, slaveholders or individuals who supported slaveholding felt that taking slaves out west to an unincorporated territory was the same as taking their cattle or their horses, that they were entitled to property anywhere in the United States. And so that was the logic behind that essentially they felt that if the government prevented them from expanding slavery out west, whether they wanted to move there or not, that was an infringement upon their property rights. The Constitution gives us the right to life, liberty, and property, not pursuit of happiness. And so they felt that was a constitutional conflict, if you will. Of course, other slaveholding states didn't necessarily feel the same way. Kind of to backtrack a little bit, that you have not many, but several slaveholding states that never seceded from the Union. As I tell my students, it's not a war between slave states and free states. It's not even a war between the North and the South. That you have slave states like Kentucky that never seceded from the Union. You have slave states like Missouri and Delaware and Maryland that never seceded from the Union. And so it's not necessarily a war between slave states and free states so much as it is an ideological war in terms of interpretations of what does property mean, what right to property, and again, we're talking about slaves here.
Mm-hmm. If a new state became a slave-holding state, they would also get two senators in Congress. Of course, if the state became a free state, they would get two senators in Congress. And maybe it was thought that the senator would side with the South or the North, depending on how they went on slavery. Was that a factor?
Not so much as senators. The House of Representatives is really where the emphasis was, because of the Three-Fifths Clause that was placed in the Constitution at the time of America's founding. Essentially, slaveholding states had increased population because of enslaved people, and therefore they could use that to enhance their representation in the House of Representatives. So to your question, in terms of a political motivation for being a slave state, that individuals wanted, individuals who supported slavery, specifically, wanted to be slave states so that they would have increased representation in the House of Representatives. That the Senate wasn't necessarily as much of a factor as the House of Representatives was.
Some of the southern states thought they were almost like sovereign countries unto themselves. And in 1850, they passed the Fugitive Slave Act, whereby slaves that escaped to the north had to be returned to the south by the free states. And I can imagine that that would go a little bit against the grain for the northern states. How was that justify that one state could pass a law that affected another state?
It's the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 wasn't necessarily that one state could pass a law that affects other states, but more to the point that now you have the federal government making a decision about slavery in the entire Union. And the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was controversial for those who were opposed to slavery, because they felt that the federal government was protecting slavery on a national level. Henry David Thoreau, the famous writer, said that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it a crime to follow your conscience, that harboring runaway slaves or defending the abolitionist movement to abolish slavery was now somehow a federal crime. And so at the time, they didn't necessarily see it as one state sort of ruling over another state by being a slaveholding state, but rather the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 represented the federal government taking a very clear stance in defense of slavery from that point on. I can talk a little bit about how the Fugitive Slave Act impacted the war itself, in that once the war started, had a bit of confusion, especially amongst Union soldiers, Union generals in particular, because everybody understood this Civil War was about slavery. So Union leaders, for example, General Benjamin Butler, you have Captain John C. Fremont out in California, and a handful of other generals and military leaders who saw their job as Union leaders to free slaves, that while they were marching into slaveholding territory, they confiscated slaves and saw their job as liberating them. Abraham Lincoln was not happy about that. As far as he was concerned, General Butler and Captain Fremont were stealing people's property. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, they were violating federal law. So this is when Benjamin Butler, General Benjamin Butler, no relation, comes up with the concept of contraband. That he says, well, no, I'm not stealing people's property. I am seizing contraband of rebellious individuals against the United States. So in the same way that he might confiscate weapons and ammunition from Confederates, he is confiscating other aspects of their property that could be used against the Union. This wasn't necessarily trickery, that General Benjamin Butler, Fremont, and other military leaders who employed this policy of contraband were doing so in a legal context that ultimately ended up making its way to Congress. Members of Congress who were frustrated with Lincoln's inaction on slavery ultimately passed a couple of confiscation acts to legitimize and legalize what General Benjamin Butler and what Captain Fremont were doing. So essentially making it legal, so that confiscating enslaved people, identifying them as contraband, would no longer be a violation of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Now, I do want to clarify, by seizing enslaved people as contraband, they are not giving them their freedom at that point. These enslaved men, women, children were essentially forced to labor for the Union for several years until after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. So, yeah, Contraband confiscation was, I guess, a step up from enslavement on a plantation, but what many enslaved people didn't realize is that when they were seized by these Union soldiers, especially in 1861, 1862, they were not genuinely free yet. They were now property of the Union Army as opposed to property of their owner.
Well, that kind of led into the Emancipation Proclamation that Abraham Lincoln declared in January 1st in 1883 or 1863. So at that point in time, when the slaves were confiscated, were they put to work for the North? Is that what would be happening?
Yeah, prior to January 1st, 1863, confiscated slaves were essentially put into the role of what we used to call camp followers. So they did labor for the Union Army, cooking meals, cleaning, and then, of course, the dirty work of picking up bodies from a battlefield, helping out an infirmary, doing whatever jobs they were assigned to do or wanted to do. Now, with the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, that changed things in a significant way for those individuals who had been labeled contraband. So now, under the Emancipation Proclamation, these individuals were free people, that they were no longer property of the Union Army. But more importantly, especially from an African American perspective, they now had the opportunity to fight for their own freedom. Prior to 1863, African American men and women, again, were property of the Union Army. After 1863, now they could fight right alongside them. So this is what gives us, for example, the famous 54th Regiment that was memorialized in the film Glory, that you have a group of African American soldiers who see themselves as fighting for their own freedom as opposed to simply being camp followers. You also have African American women such as Harriet Tubman, who planned and executed attacks or assaults because of their knowledge of the South, because of their knowledge of plantations. They were able to help the Union, and later on in life secured a pension as someone who had served in the United States military during the Civil War. So the Emancipation Proclamation was significant on that end in, again, legitimizing the freedom of those individuals who had previously been labeled contraband, and also opening a door for military service for black men. However, that having been said, I want to clarify that the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 was primarily designed by Abraham Lincoln as a punishment for the Confederacy. The prior year, September of 1862, after the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln had issued sort of an ultimatum to Confederate states that if they didn't rejoin the Union, if they didn't put down their weapons, they were going to be sorry. He was going to take action on this issue of slavery, and he didn't necessarily identify what it was. So when the Southern states did not rejoin the Union, they did not lay down their weapons and surrender. That's when he initiated Emancipation Proclamation, again as his sort of punishment for them not doing what he wanted them to do. So the Emancipation Proclamation specifically, quote unquote, freed slaves in states in rebellion. That means that's a lot. So what that means is that states that and territories that had not been reclaimed by the Union, Abraham Lincoln was declaring their slaves free. So let's take Tennessee, for example. That Tennessee was part of the Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln makes this announcement. As far as Tennessee lawmakers are concerned, Abraham Lincoln is not their president. Jefferson Davis is their president of the Confederate States of America. So this Emancipation Proclamation, as far as they were concerned, didn't apply to them. That was a law of the United States, and they were not part of the United States. So, unfortunately for enslaved people, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't really change anything overnight. If you were an enslaved person in Tennessee, the Emancipation Proclamation meant nothing unless you could get to Union sides, and the Union Army could then guarantee your freedom, and you could potentially join the military. But again, if you're on a plantation somewhere outside of Memphis, the Emancipation Proclamation really had no immediate effect. In addition to that, keep in mind that, like I said, the Emancipation Proclamation was specifically for states in rebellion. As I noted earlier, there were many slave states that were not in rebellion. So this didn't apply to them at all. For example, in Kentucky, Missouri, etc. So the Emancipation Proclamation, again, was more of a political move on Abraham Lincoln's part so that he could mobilize black troops because the number of white troops in the Union Army were declining, and there was a lot of resistance to the recently instituted Union military draft. Some of you guys out there might be familiar with the New York City draft riots, that many people in the Union were not happy about that military draft. So by initiating the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln could again mobilize black troops. So it was more of a military measure than it was an actual measure of social justice.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Well, you used Tennessee as an example, but Tennessee really was a special case, wasn't it?
Sure, indeed. First of all, Tennessee was not part of the original 7 states to secede from the Union, and that's because Tennessee was and is heavily divided. Prior to and even during the Civil War, while West Tennessee had a little less than 40% of its population was enslaved African Americans, that was in drastic contradiction to East Tennessee, which you have less than 10% of the population was enslaved African Americans. So it varied widely, broadly in the state of Tennessee in terms of slaveholding. Middle Tennessee, where we're at, was kind of on the fence, 50-50. So when the question of secession came up in 1860, prior to Lincoln's inauguration, Tennessee debated it and decided not to secede. However, after the battle at Fort Sumter, this is when Tennesseans who may have been opposed to slavery, or at least on the fence, made the decision to secede from the Union, not because Lincoln's views were quote-unquote hostile towards slavery, but because of this notion of the War of Northern Aggression by Lincoln sending troops to reinforce those that were under attack by the Confederacy. Then there's the war itself, that during the war you have a mixed bag within Tennessee of those individuals who support the Confederacy and those individuals who support the Union. Both political leaders were on both sides, as well as average Tennesseans. You have a significant number of Tennesseans who went and joined the Union, a significant number that joined the Confederacy. So, for example, I even read recently that a significant number of troops that were with General Sherman on his march to the Georgia Sea Islands were from Tennessee, that they were Tennessee volunteers. So you have sort of this dual legacy in the state of Tennessee, individuals who are very proud of their rebellious spirit in serving the Confederacy, and those who are very proud of being loyal to the Union during the course of the war. In February of 1865, so that's essentially almost 2 months before the war ended in April of 1865. So before General Lee's surrender, Tennessee lawmakers decide that they are going to abolish slavery and that they are going to essentially lay down their weapons to some extent. So this makes Tennessee another unusual case that even before the war is officially over, before the Confederacy before the Confederacy surrenders, you have lawmakers in Tennessee already anticipating emancipation and what a new Tennessee is going to look like. So they drafted a new constitution, which incorporated emancipation in February of 1865.
So the North is winning the war, and they're moving from east to west, and they've Louisiana falls, and the North is headed for Texas, and General Gordon. Help me.
And I can't because I don't have it in my notes. That's how candid I am in my classes. Granger, thank you. I knew it started with a G.
He moves into Galveston, Texas, and he issues the General Order Number 3. And if you were to read the order, it's one paragraph long. It's not very much. Did General Granger issue that order based on the Emancipation Proclamation, or did he have other authority to make that order?
Simple answer is yes. Yes, it was based on the Emancipation Proclamation, but yes, he had other intentions with Order Number 3. Order Number 3 specifically applied to Texas, as you noted, that as a general, he had the same capacity that other generals do to issue field orders in the area that he's responsible for. So when he moved into Texas after the war in June of 1865, he was there in the capacity of reconstruction to help reconstruct Texas. And so what he was doing wasn't necessarily an attempt to legitimize emancipation, but to give it meaning. So Order Number 3 doesn't just guarantee freedom of African Americans in Texas. The language of it also talks about them owning property and having individual rights that are codified under law. That's something the Emancipation Proclamation never addressed. And keep in mind, when he issued this order in June of 1865, the 13th Amendment had not yet been ratified and become part of the Constitution. So what he was doing with Order Number 3 is not just saying, hey, these slaves are free, but giving that freedom meaning by saying that they have rights as individuals, as Americans. They have a right to their own property. They have a right to enter contracts. This was something that was never included under the Emancipation Proclamation, and is really foreshadowing the significance of the 13th and later 14th Amendments in expanding civil rights for American citizens. Now, in addition to Granger's order, you have other generals that are issuing field orders that are unique to those locations. So, for example, this General Granger's order Number 3 is important to people in Texas, and especially out in western United States. That's where we get Juneteenth, is because he issued this on June 19th of 1865. And so many individuals west of the Mississippi commemorated that general order each year thereafter as Juneteenth. East of the Mississippi, we have a different relationship with Juneteenth because, of course, it didn't necessarily apply out east. So, for example, in Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, you have a rich tradition of celebrating General Sherman's Special Field Order 15. This is where we get the idea of 40 acres and a mule. So, for example, while Granger was issuing Order Number 3, guaranteeing emancipation, General Sherman is issuing Special Field Order 15, which essentially reallocates abandoned property. Slave owners had bailed on their property because they knew they were potentially going to be charged with treason. Mm-hmm. So many of them fled south to Mexico or to the Caribbean or farther west. And so you have all this abandoned property. Sherman says, well, we have abandoned property, we have free labor, let's put these two things together. And so, especially in the eastern coast of the United States, there's a rich history and tradition of celebrating that, celebrating this realization of freedom. That, again, the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 was nice idea, but it's not until you have something like General Order Number 3 or Special Field Order 15 that gives that freedom some meaning for enslaved people, that they can actually do something with that freedom, get their hand in the dirt and make money themselves, enter into contracts, make money for themselves, and again, have rights as individuals.
So that 40 acres and a mule that they were hoping for, did that occur was that specific to the eastern states, or was that looking to out west?
It was specific to the territory that General Sherman had control over in the Georgia Sea Islands. So again, we're looking at parts of coastal South Carolina, coastal Georgia, coastal Florida, and unfortunately, word spread that hey, the federal government's given away 40 acres and a mule. So other enslaved people thought that this was going to come their way, when no, that this was a field order specifically for that region. But just like General Order Number 3, word about these actions spreads and ends up becoming part myth, part celebration within the black community because of what they represent. Now, in the Georgia Sea Islands, yes, initially you did have a reallocation of property that enslaved families did temporarily receive land and a mule as compensation for generations in slavery. However, after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson takes over as president, and Andrew Johnson was very much committed to reorganizing the Union as quickly as possible. In doing so, he was adamant and very passionate about issuing pardons, as many pardons as possible, as quickly as possible, to the point that by the summer of 1865, keep in mind this is months after the war ended in April of 1865, Johnson even puts together a special group of advisors to kind of rubber stamp pardons for him, because he was too busy doing other things to issue as many pardons as he wanted to. In doing so, those individuals who had abandoned their property in the Georgia Sea Islands are now pardoned, and they are encouraged to go home and reclaim their property. Even though you have Special Field Order 15, even though the Freedmen's Bureau that had been established was trying to redistribute abandoned property, Johnson's orders, Johnson's pardons, essentially overturned that. So, enslaved people who had seized this property were now essentially evicted from that property. If they wanted to stay on that property, they were forced to sign very demeaning contracts with their former owners. And so, yeah, that whole idea of 40 acres and a mule was temporary because of Johnson's insistence on reorganizing the Union quickly.
So, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation was a decree that Abraham Lincoln issued, but decrees don't last forever.
Correct.
So they had to codify that into law, and so the 13th Amendment came about to forbid slavery throughout the United States. And at that particular point in time, there were states that were still holding slaves. Is that correct?
Correct.
Mostly the border states?
At the time, so there's a long history in terms of how amendments work. So with constitutional amendments, they are drafted and, of course, voted upon by Congress. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution was actually passed by Congress early in 1865, before the war's over. So the war is still going on. So the answer to your question is yeah, there's lots of states that are still holding slaves when the 13th Amendment is passed by Congress. Now, an amendment doesn't become real, it doesn't become a thing until it's ratified. So the 13th Amendment isn't ratified until December of 1865. That's the very end of that same year. So what happens is, of course, there's some confusion that here you have many states that were part of the Union that are going to ratify the 13th Amendment because they had always been loyal to the Union. So the question is, how do we get states that just fought a war to defend slavery, how do we get them to voluntarily sign a document saying they're going to abolish slavery? Again, enter Andrew Johnson. And this is part of the reason why Lincoln sort of picked Andrew Johnson as his running mate during his second term, is because Johnson was a Southerner. He's from Tennessee. And he did have sympathies towards slave-owning Southerners. And so Lincoln thought that Johnson would be sort of a good fit for reorganizing the Union, and Johnson assumed that role after Lincoln's death. So when Johnson becomes president, his conditions for Reconstruction, for rejoining the Union, were ratification of the 13th Amendment. So essentially what Congress, through Johnson, indicated to rebellious states is that if you want to send representatives to the House, if you want senators in Congress, if you want all the benefits that come with being a state in the Union, you have to ratify the 13th Amendment first, then we'll talk. So this is how the 13th Amendment gets ratified, is that Southern states who had previously fought against slavery as a condition of rejoining the Union ratify the 13th Amendment. So there's still that question, why would they do this? Because, again, why aren't they just going to keep fighting? Well, Johnson made it a sweet deal. Sure, they can ratify the 13th Amendment, which officially abolishes slavery or condition of servitude in the United States, except in conditions of imprisonment. That is a very important clause. So what ends up happening immediately is as new state constitutions are drafted, for example, Tennessee drafted a new state constitution to rejoin the Union and abolish slavery. However, those new state constitutions also included a litany of laws criminalizing blackness. So essentially, if African American men, women, or even young people, people we would consider children, 14-year-olds, if they didn't have proof of employment, they were considered vagrants and could be locked up in prison. Oh, but have no fear. Private enterprise could buy them out of prison and use their labor for free. So that's what I mean by making it a sweet deal, that even though these former Confederate states ratified the 13th Amendment, they did so with the knowledge that they could draft their new laws and new state constitutions in such a way, because of the language of the 13th Amendment, that again, by criminalizing blackness, they could incarcerate the black population and therefore get free labor that way. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, that's a good point you made, because one of the most famous instances of that is the Ballad of John Henry. Mm-hmm. He was arrested and sent to prison, and then he was let out to work on a gang that was tunneling in, I think, West Virginia. So he's like a famous example of that very fact.
Sure. And as I tell my students in a lot of my classes, that a lot of the Reconstruction that we see in the South after the Civil War was technically done by slave labor. The irony of that, right? That here the war is over, this war that fought against slavery is long gone, yet you have slavery by another name, as we say, that individuals who thought they were free are now incarcerated in very large numbers, forced to rebuild the South economically and structurally as well.
Usually after a war, the victor has the pleasure of writing history to fit their purposes. But after the Civil War, the situation was completely different. And the South, trying to justify their actions, came up with this theory of the lost cause. Could you talk a little bit about what that pertained to?
Sure. And I think it's I'm speaking kind of as an outsider. For those who are listening, I'm an African American woman, but I am from the South, so I have some knowledge that I think the lost cause means, just like freedom means something different to different populations of African Americans in the South, I think the lost cause also has a local history or regional history. That, again, in Tennessee, we have this rich history of a war of northern aggression. In other places, there's a very rich history of identifying themselves as rebels, that their actions in the Civil War were somehow a continuation of the American Revolutionary spirit. So it's very broad in that sense. But in another way, the lost cause is also this idea that of what the South could have been, that the South, in popular memory amongst non-African Americans, at least in the South, that the South was this wonderful territory that they had created, this land of freedom that they had created, and that Northerners, the Union, had taken that away. So the idea of the lost cause is that the devastation after the war, the poverty, the unemployment, the taxation, all of these things were the North's fault. They were African American people's fault. They were not the fault of Confederates who seceded from the Union and betrayed their country. It's instead the fault of the victors, that the South is sort of stagnant economically and politically and socially. I also want to add that this idea of the lost cause, while it most definitely manifested in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, it really didn't expand and gain popularity until around the 1920s, a little after World War I, as the Ku Klux Klan, founded in Pulaski, Tennessee, revived itself and gained a resurgence. A lot of this has to do with D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation, which celebrated the Ku Klux Klan. And the film Birth of a Nation really glorified and delved deep into this idea of the lost cause. That this idea that after the Civil War, African Americans were running rampant in the South and harming white Americans, particularly white women. And so there's this whole mythology that's created through the film Birth of a Nation that former Confederates, neo-Confederates really latched onto, because it provided, I think, a safe explanation for them for, again, why the South was economically and socially stagnant, one that they didn't have to grapple with. So by blaming the North, by blaming African Americans, by blaming any other group of people for their circumstance, it gives them a feeling of righteousness moving forward. And it also allows them to celebrate their ancestors, which history has not been kind to, because they were slaveholders, because they were treasonous. That the lost cause allows them to hold on to this memory of their ancestors and themselves being true Americans in some way. That makes sense.
Yeah, I'm glad we have time. I wanted to ask you this question, which is hard for me to wrap my mind around. But during the Civil War, the Republican Party was a new party, but they were, I would say, progressive. I'll say that. They were wanting to create change, to create more freedoms for mostly African American people. But today, and vice versa, the Democratic Party was the party of the South. They were, most of the plantation owners were, part of the Democratic Party. But today it seems like it's just the opposite. The Democratic Party prides itself on being more progressive, and the Republican Party now is conservative, which implies not wanting to change. So what caused the flip?
Sure. It's a very long story, so I'll try to make it brief. We see a beginning of this shift around the time of Franklin Roosevelt. It's not a complete shift. It's kind of like hints or sprinkles of progressivism during Franklin Roosevelt's administration, which of course overlaps with the Great Depression, World War II. Prior to Franklin Roosevelt, like you said, the Republican Party was seen as more progressive, while as the Democratic Party was seen as being very conservative and what we would call a sort of constitutionalist, constructionalist. We're going to stick to the exact wording of the Constitution. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt, through his New Deal, passed a lot of progressive legislation. He was also seen as championing women's rights and African American rights, but I want to point out that he did so reluctantly. And so that's why I like your use of the word progressive, that they're not necessarily liberal by choice, but rather by force. That the people, the American people, whether it be the women's suffrage movement or women's activists or African American activists, are going into the streets and lobbying Congress and trying to get these things done. So that was the beginning. We see another major step with John F. Kennedy. He was another Democrat, Now, he had very conservative views when it came to foreign policy and the American economy, as a true Democrat would at that time. But as we now know, John F. Kennedy also had some progressive ideas when it came to women's rights, African American rights, immigration, those things. We don't see a complete shift until essentially the end of Richard Nixon's administration. When Richard Nixon was an early politician, many people don't know that Richard Nixon was a Quaker. He was very progressive through his upbringing. He becomes conservative in his rise to power and fame. We see that other Republicans around him become more conservative. Meanwhile, Democrats become more liberal because of Kennedy, because of Johnson, because of the civil rights movement pushing them in that direction. So again, this was a gradual process. And what we really see as a sort of definitive moment of this shift is the election of 1968, in which you have, again, a division like we had seen earlier in American history, where the Democratic Party is divided, that you have Democratic candidates and then you have Dixiecrats candidates. Dixiecrats are conservative Democrats who did not like the progressive way the Democratic Party was going. Most represented by George Wallace, who ran for president in 1968 under the Dixiecrat banner. And so that's where we see a very clear shift. We have Democrats who are seeing themselves as progressive. We have Dixiecrats who are fighting against that progressive image. And then we have Nixon, who ends up winning as a Republican because of this division. And so thereafter is when we see that. But just to sort of wrap up, what I'd like to say is that I think we're kind of still there, that even though the Democratic Party presents itself as being a liberal party, I think it is by force, that it requires people taking to the streets, lobbying their members of Congress, going out and voting and canvassing and getting people registered to vote, that it takes action to make progress. You can't just expect lawmakers to do it on their own. We see the Republican Party doing those things to hold their politicians accountable, etc. So I think on both sides of the aisle, the American people need to do things to get their party to act in the way that they would like them to act or behave or pass laws, etc.
Well, I thank you, Dr. Butler. This has been a very informative talk, especially for me. And I want to thank you for coming and joining us today.
Thank you for having me. This is fun.
Courtney Funeral Home. Well, they're a fifth-generation funeral home taking care of the people of Franklin County since 1905. They're committed to serving you, dedicated to providing personalized, professional, and compassionate service to help lighten